Good evening. I'm Harold Pachios. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and I'm pretty excited about this one. We have a guest who we've had before in the past when he was the director of the Maine Heritage Policy Center, the conservative think tank based here in Portland, Lance Dutson. Lance, welcome here again.
Thanks a lot for having me.
A little bit about Lance. Lance has been a consultant in a number of Republican campaigns. He's worked a couple of times with Susan Collins and Charlie Summers. He ran Charlie Summers' campaign for the U.S. Senate. He's been around. He's a conservative. He's a true conservative, not one of those phony conservatives, and a very intelligent guy, and he writes a column in the Bangor Daily News, and it's a very interesting column. He is an honest guy, and like many of the, I think, intelligent national columnists who are conservatives, Bill Kristol and Charles Krauthammer before he died, George Will, David Brooks, they don't put up with any of this, any of the clown performances. They would have said that those people would have said, and I think some of them did about our previous governor, that there were clown aspects to it, and the same thing with our president. And Lance Dutson is a lot like them in that he believes in conservative principles, but not in Trumpism and not in LePageism. And so I think it's important for us to talk with Lance about that and to get some of his insights, and we're delighted you're here.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back.
You weren't a great fan, even though you were a well-known Republican, can I use the word operative?
I think so.
But LePage attacked you. I understand that at one time he actually had a press conference, which was to push back. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, it's tough being a Republican and pushing back against leaders in your own party. And I worked in 2010 for the Maine Republican Party and helped Governor LePage get elected, and put a lot of time into it, and I believe strongly in free market conservative principles, and so have always been a proud Republican until this shift, I think, in the culture of the Republican Party started when Governor LePage was elected. And I saw it through a general approach. I worked in the State House at the time when his administration started, and there was not a very good management style. He wasn't very successful in working with others and so forth.
You worked in the State House?
I did. I worked for the Republican Speaker of the House in 2011 when Republicans took power for the first time in years. But the thing that really bothered me, people manage differently, and you're going to have good leaders and bad leaders. But the line that LePage crossed for me was the line in the subject of race, where he started using some very cynical language about racial relations in order to wind people up, I guess. And there were a number of incidents that happened. There was an incident where the governor was at a Republican fundraiser and he said Barack Obama hates white people. There were a number of these type of things that happened. But at one point, LePage was at a town hall in Bridgeton, and this became a very famous moment when he told a crowd of press that black men were coming up to Maine and they were selling drugs and they were impregnating young white women and then leaving. And it was such a shocking statement, but nobody covered it. And I heard about that story either that night or the night before. Talked to some friends in the media. They went back and they reviewed the tape, and they said, yep, he said it, but nobody reported it. I mean, we had radio, television, print reporters there. No one said a word. So when they found the tape, and I had this confirmed by 2 different main news sources, they came back and they said, yeah. I said, well, you going to report on it? And they said, no. Our editor said no. So I took the quote and I took my letterhead out and put a press release out and said that this happened. And so then the news reported that I was making this claim, and then it blew up, and it became the biggest story in America, on trending story on Facebook and Twitter for a number of days. It was a huge, huge story. The governor then had a press conference to explain why what he said wasn't wrong. And at one point in the press conference, he chastised the press, saying that they're in the pockets of an adversarial blogger. So he never said my name, actually, but I was very proud to have instigated that.
And everybody knew who he was talking about.
Yes, but the point, it's a very difficult issue, and it's very problematic, and it's really bothered me about what happened with Governor LePage and what we see with President Trump now, that the Republican Party is not a home for racism. It's not part of the culture of the party. It's not part of the ideals of the party. But there have been people like LePage and Trump who have used the levers of the cynical methodology to gain power and to keep people wound up. That's base, and if there aren't people within our party that call it out to establish that this is not what a Republican is like, then people are going to believe that that's what Republicans are like. Now, I've lived in Portland for a long time, and I've always joked that I never put bumper stickers on my car, I never put lawn signs in my yard because I'm afraid my tires are going to get slashed. It's not a very Republican city. Yeah. But one of the things that drove me crazy for many years is to go and to talk to people at a cocktail party or at a social event or at a school event for the kids and have that reaction when you tell them you're a Republican. And that's something that it doesn't make me want to not be a Republican, but it makes me very angry that we are looked at in that way, because I don't believe the stereotypes of Republicans hating poor people, Republicans hating sick people, and Republicans being racist. But there have been some very prominent Republicans who have done all those things, and I feel very strongly that part of my duty and everybody's duty as a good Republican is to speak up when those things happen so that we can distinguish between fringe elements and what mainstream Republicans really believe in.
All politics is putting together coalitions of groups. And of course the Democrats, one of my younger days, before 1960, benefited greatly because every Democrat who ran for president of the United States for 100 years could count on every electoral vote in the South. Mm-hmm. Every one. And the issue was race. That was the issue. Mm-hmm. And every Democratic politician, every southern state had 2 Democratic senators and all Democratic House delegations. Mm-hmm. So that was a great source of political power for the Democrats. It was all built on race. All of it was built on race. And in fact, and I've told you this story, and I'm going to tell them this story, when the first Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, the Public Accommodations Act, I was working in the White House. Bill Moyers was kind of the chief of staff. He got the call in the mid to late evening that the Senate had passed the bill, and he went to the president's bedroom where the president was in bed reading. And he said to President Johnson, "You've made history, Mr. President. The Senate just passed the bill, and they're sending it down to you for signature." And Johnson was kind of morose. And he looked at Moyers and he said, "Bill, I think we've just turned the South over to the Republican Party for my generation and yours." And he was 100% right. Just on that issue, only issue, race, the South became solidly Republican, where it had always been solidly Republican, Democrat, on the same issue, race. So people, Lance, I talk to a lot of people who, particularly in the state, say, no, there's not much racism around, and that's not a real major issue. They're fooling themselves. They're absolutely wrong. It's been around for thousands of years, and it's still with us, and American politics proves it. And Nixon had the Southern strategy.
Sure. Well, there's two things that are at play. There of course, is latent xenophobia or racism or tribalism within our culture, and I think it's there a lot more than people like to admit, especially in Maine. But there's also the forces of exploitation in politics. And, was Nixon a racist? Are these leaders, inherently racist because they exploit it? I don't know what they think in their hearts or what they believe really deep down, but their actions have been exploitative of these things. I think we saw it with LePage, and I think we see it with Trump right now. That whenever the most powerful force in the world from the beginning of humanity has been this feeling of being persecuted because of someone else. And, we all have our lives that we're dissatisfied by in some way or another. And if there's someone that we can blame it on, it's the easiest way out. And smart politicians understand this. And that's why you've always got heroes and villains. And the issue of race, I think, in this country it's so unfortunate because something that we should be on the path, and I think we are on the path toward improving in our transit from being a nation that enslaved people of a certain race to the point where that's erased from our daily life. In transit, there are tensions. And political figures throughout time have exploited those tensions in a very base way. To get voters in Maine worried about the border wall with Mexico and to have it be a potent and effective political tool, which it is the height of cynicism to me. We have nothing to fear from the Mexican border in Maine. Now, the drug issue is something that is thrown in there as a way to try to justify it. And certainly border security and the importation of drugs is a big problem that needs to be handled. But worrying about a poor Mexican family or Central American family coming up and stealing something from us when we live in Millinocket or Pachios or Bangor, Maine, it's absurd. But there is something latent in our psyches that is more easily exploited by that kind of xenophobia than we like to realize. So my feeling is there's the people that understand that, or the people that are honest enough to say it, have a duty to speak loud against it, even if it's in your own party. Right now, the Republican Party is basing itself essentially on a border wall. We've got a president who is bypassing the Constitution in order to fulfill a campaign political promise, because he knows the battle for this, even though he'll lose. He knows the battle is going to crank people up, and the people that are afraid or who listen to his words or have been exploited by people that are trying to create this xenophobic backlash, he knows that it's going to be effective for him. And so even though he knows that the strategy is probably not going to work to deter immigration or illegal immigration, even though he knows he probably will lose in court for even the concept, it's worth it to him to engage in that because of the political payoff of the exploitation of people's fears. And I think that's terrible.
So I agree with what you said. I would go a step further. I would say that if the Republican Party does not want to be known as a home for racists, then the leaders of the Republican Party have to do what you do, which is to speak out, and they don't. And the change for the Democrats came with Kennedy and Johnson. Look, Woodrow Wilson, great icon of the Democratic Party, was a racist. And in fact, every well-known Democrat, in the very least, just tiptoed around the issue, tiptoed around it.
Right.
So until we got to Kennedy, and then Kennedy started talking about it, and then Lyndon Johnson, a president from the South, a guy who had been a Southern politician for all those years, he made it happen. He was totally committed to changing it. He knew it would have enormous adverse political effect on the Democratic Party. we need Republicans to do what Lyndon Johnson did and to say we are not a home for racists. So there would be no home for racists. But now there is, and we have Trump's dog whistles that say, follow me. The fact of the matter is, I said this to you earlier, hard to imagine that there's a true white supremacist in America, and there are many. There is one that would be a Democrat today. There is no place for a white supremacist in the Democratic Party today. But apparently, Trump knows that there is in the Republican Party. They're not Republicans like your Republicans, these white supremacists. They vote Republican because of people like Trump and LePage saying, stick with us.
Well, you know, I think that's true, and it's incredibly cynical. I don't think that there's a home for white supremacists in the Republican Party. I think there's a home for them in a Trump presidency, or in a situation where Republican ideals are swept off the table in exchange for a cult of personality, like we have with this president. And I do think that you're seeing the advent of a louder voice within the Republican Party against some of these things.
I haven't heard it.
Well, I think that, you know, if you look at Republican or conservative intelligentsia from, like you had mentioned, Bill Kristol, the National Review, Weekly Standard,
right.
You know, all these institutional voices.
Peggy Noonan.
Yeah, and you know, look, conservatives like Krauthammer, like you said. I mean, he's not a wishy-washy moderate, or wasn't.
No.
But one of the scary things is that their voices didn't matter. That this rise in populism behind Trump was so powerful that people that, you know, I grew up reading and learning about politics from, you know, really, you know, basically Republican saints, were just washed away in this. But I don't think that's permanent. You know, just as I think the main Republican Party is going to shift back toward the model of Olympia Snowe and Bill Cohen and Susan Collins, we had this you know, anomaly in LePage, and I think we have an anomaly in Trump, and we're as a culture learning very hard lessons. You know, we are in a business, or political people are in a business where you win by convincing other people that you're right. That's how you change a society or change things to your belief system. And when you get in these silos, and when there's this temporary power grab that happened with LePage and it's happened with Trump, it may benefit them in the short term, in their cadre in a short term of 8 years or 4 years. But over the long run, for the, you know, the sake of the nation, the sake of conservatism, the sake of Republicans, there's going to have to be a shift away from this for the party to survive it all. And I think you'll see that happen.
Well, I agree with the part there will have to be a shift away for the party to survive. We're calling this show, you know, the evolution of the Trumpist Party and the decline of the Republican Party, and you obviously don't agree with that notion, but it's different, and I don't know who the Republicans are that say there is, you know, we occasionally, when there's some, you know, Charlottesville statement by the president, then they push back a little bit, but basically they leave him alone. Basically they coddle the guy and protect him, and he's playing that race card all the time. Look, here's a newspaper article from the Washington Post. The way that they attack the Washington Post, they're no friends of Trump, but this is a poll they talk about. And it says, we have known for some time supporters of President Trump tend to have sharply different views of racial issues than do other groups. For example, a poll taken shortly before the 2016 election found those who planned to vote for Trump were more likely than not to say they were worried about reverse racism. That is, they worried whites would face racial discrimination. A poll from YouGov conducted in the same period found Trump voters identified white Americans as the group that faced the most discrimination in the country at twice the rates black Americans face discrimination. And I know people like that. And do you think, I'm just speculating now, that the reason that 15 Republicans many of them, you know, smart, accomplished Republicans ran for president last time, or a dozen, or whatever it was, and just got overwhelmed by Trump, killed, run over. He won going away. He won easy. He destroyed all those Republicans. Why? Maybe this is a reason that he was willing to do and say things that they're not willing to do and say.
Well, I think that might be part of it. I actually, part of what you said, I believe, is all of it. It's a break happened that year with Trump, in that the falseness in the kind of put on formality of the way presidential candidates conduct themselves in debates and so forth, it changed. And this idea of a rock star president or a reality show president, that was a cultural shift that I don't think it had to do necessarily with the ideology that you're talking about. I think it played into it, but I think we're in a different era now. I mean, the way people consume media now is far different than it used to be, and I think that was a change in history that I don't think we're going to see this formal presidential run like we did forever before that, where people are very stiff and unguarded. Trump has a magical power in that he's completely comfortable in himself all the time. And when someone asks him a question, he doesn't think to himself, how should I answer this? Or how does this poll? Or what have my advisors told me? He just shoots from the hip. And done correctly, that's a very endearing thing. We saw Marco Rubio during that primary try to go in the same place with him, but he couldn't pull it out because he doesn't have that natural talent. So I think that's a big part of why Trump won, because people are generally dissatisfied with the American political system, and when they see someone who appears to be telling it like it is, that's got a very magnetic charm to it.
And telling it like it is, the race part is important in that. You know, the theory is, and I know people like this, well, politically correct means you can't say anything bad about a black person. That's what that's code. Attacking political correctness is code. And I blame the Democrats for stoking some of that. I mean, they should be blamed for that as well. But I just think that there are a lot of resenters, angry resenters out there, and he captured them by saying things that they could say, look at him, he's not politically correct, he's telling the truth, and stop saying happy holidays and begin saying Merry Christmas.
Right.
That stokes a lot of people. For many people, that's as important as anything. Say Merry Christmas, not happy holidays. They're angry, they're resentful.
Right, well, because it's symptomatic of a broader problem, I think, with liberal academia pushing things too far. But we are in a weird place when it comes to these type of things. And political correctness and the racial issues all kind of tie in together in a lot of ways. I mean, we are a country where we're still repairing this awful thing that happened with slavery in this country. And it's not fixed, and things aren't equal. But the people that are here and trying to deal with that are generations removed from the people who actually were to blame for it. So, it's a really heady, abstract exercise that we're trying to do as a culture here. And so for white people who are removed from that to see that somehow their free passage is somehow limited because of an effort, a very noble effort in this country to try to repair this horrible sin of slavery, that's complicated. And that's what I was talking about with the tensions, that we're moving into a better place. And along the way, there's going to be tensions. The noble way for America to deal with that is to accept it and to try to educate and to try to make people understand why this political correctness thing sometimes pops up too much, or why there are affirmative action programs and things like that. But we don't have that. What we have are talk radio hosts who are dying for ratings and dying to sell their plastic bags of bunker food or whatever they're doing, and they gin people up to say you're being exploited, and they do it on both sides. It's a game of who can get their people madder at the other side. That's how ratings
The
are,
only
and that's how
problem-
political
The only
power
problem is there are not that
accrued.
many Democrat radio hosts. I mean, it's a Republican game with those radio people.
Well, talk radio is, but now we have cable channels, and you have different mediums where it happens on both sides. But we talked about this a little bit earlier. The problem, I think, with the political power aspect of this is that we are in this age where base turnout is the strategy model instead of winning the argument. That's really where our problem is. If we lived in a town of 10 or 11 people, and I wanted a road to go here and you wanted a road to go there, you and I would call those other people, we'd take our plans out and we'd say, I'm right, this is why, and I hope you'll be on my side. That's not what happens in American politics anymore. American politics says you go back to your silos, you get them ginned up, you get them as angry as possible, and you make sure they turn out in bigger numbers to vote. That's an unsustainable political system because it degrades the whole concept of public square or trying to convince people that you're right. And that's where we are right now.
I'm smiling because just 3 hours ago I got an email from a former Democrat gubernatorial candidate, not a famous one, but ran for governor, saying that the Portland mayor, Ethan Strimling, was being attacked by Fox News, and please send $25 so Ethan can fight back against Fox News. Exactly.
Sure.
And I looked at that and I said, oh boy, what have we come to?
But it works.
But it works. But every president, they all have had their issues, but every president gets to be president. They say, I'm president of all of the people in this country, and I'm trying to build a bigger coalition and bring more people under the tent. And we got one now that's just the opposite, which is what you say.
Right.
You know, he likes the base and the silo. I was thinking about Ronald Reagan, who was trying to convince all of the people to, like him and support him and so forth. The other thing that Reagan did, we talk about politically correct, he knew how to act like a president. He thought the American people have this image of what a president should be and how a president should behave. This guy doesn't give a damn, the current guy. He's a clown. I don't know whether we can show this. I don't know whether you saw the CPAC address. He get 2.5 hours. He spoke to the conservative conference.
Right.
And it's a show. It's a show. He walks out onto the stage like, a carny barker, and there's an American flag there. Can we show it? Look at this. Now, this is a showman, not a president, a showman. Look, watch. And watch his face. Look. See, okay, look at that. So, can you imagine Ronald Reagan doing that?
Well, Ronald Reagan wouldn't have to do that. There was no...
No, but can you
Right.
imagine any American president? They'd be embarrassed to do it.
Right.
Nothing embarrasses this man. Nothing embarrasses him. But he has 85% of the Republicans like him. They like him because they say, well, we know he's a little crude and he's immoral and he may even be a criminal, but he's doing stuff we like. And what is the stuff that they like?
Well, this is a great question, and I believe basically where you're going. But I think we have to look back to where this really broke, which was Bill Clinton's presidency, because Democrats were saying the exact same thing. They saw, especially Democrats, because this is an issue that we can reflect back on now that we've gone through the Me Too movement and so forth. That it's generally not the right that is trying to fight for the Me Too issues. Female exploitation and workplace, issues like that. But Bill Clinton acted terribly.
Yes, I agree with that.
Democrats closed rank.
Yes.
And stuck by him. And I think that model, I don't think the same thing happened with George W. Bush, and I don't think the same thing happened with Barack Obama, but it's happening again with Trump, where
You couldn't. What are you going to say about George? What are you going to say about the morals of George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Barack Obama? I mean, these guys behave themselves.
Right. Well, people criticize them about their policy decisions,
yeah.
and that's where it should be, right? But you mentioned Reagan, and he's very symbolic, I think, of the idea of how a leader can express reverence for the office and for the country that inspires others. That Ronald Reagan lifted our national mood after a time when it wasn't in a great place. But what Trump's doing now, and I think what Democrats did around Clinton during his time in office, is he's forcing people to make decisions about their political loyalty above the what's good for the nation, not just from a policy standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint. And I think that is really problematic because it works. But I think that we go back to something we said before about whether this is the new Republican Party is the party of Trump. The thing about populist leaders like Trump and like LePage in Maine is that they don't create legacy very well. So when he's gone, he's gone. There isn't going to be a Trump Jr. Mike Pence is not going to become the next president and act like Donald Trump.
Of course he won't. He'd act the opposite of him.
That's right.
But we could get a Democrat reality show person. Mm-hmm. We could get somebody, Howard Stern.
Yep, we might
run as a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And if Donald Trump can get elected, maybe Howard Stern can get elected president. Mm-hmm. So that's what I worry about.
And Trump and others like him are a symptom. They're not the problem. I mean, Trump got elected by the American democratic system. So somewhere within all of us is the blame for the things that we're looking at now. And I think that we're not going to have a self-reflective American moment about Donald Trump until we get out of this siloed party or nothing mentality. And that's the broader scale problem here. Trump is a one-term or two-term issue. But the polarization that's happened and the loyalty to party over country that's happened on both sides is the, I think, multi-generational problem that we need to solve.
But it amazes me. Trump yesterday attacked the Democrats for investigating him, and they said, and he said, look, these people. We should be talking about what we can do for the American people. We have problems to solve and so forth. Well, he hasn't solved any problems. What he's done is two things that I know of substantively. He's nominated 2 conservative Supreme Court justices. I can't imagine a single Republican who wouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. A single one. Every one of those people running for president in the Republican ticket the last time would have done the same thing. That's not Trump. He didn't deliver that. Mm-hmm. You had whoever Republican president would do the same thing. The other thing was the tax bill that is creating the deficit is now doubled this year from last year. Mm-hmm. Predicted to double. That's not Republican. Mm-hmm. That's not you never hear a Republican talk about deficit spending. Isn't it bad? When Obama, imagine if this deficit grew the way it is now under Obama, what would be said?
Sure.
So I don't get it. Why aren't they saying, I would say we'd be better off with Pence than this guy. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting he should be impeached, but I'm just saying I would hope that we'd get rid of him and get another real Republican as president. Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree with you there. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems to all this, though, is what's happening on the other side of the aisle. When we've got the loudest voices in the Democratic Party in America talking about socialism and fighting that battle, I mean, I think that's a loaded term, but it's a term that means a lot to people, especially in older generations in this country who, saw half a billion people murdered in the 20th century under the hands of socialism. To a younger generation and to the AOCs of the world, this may seem like fun and games and theoretical politics, but that means something in this country. So when you're a center-right Republican who is looking at the options between an ill-behaved reality show star that is, talking about loving America and supporting the troops and lowering taxes and allowing businesses to grow, and then you look at the Democratic Party and you see, these young radicals coming up talking about reverting America to socialism, and that we need to have that discussion. I mean, that's a big problem. I think you're going to have a hard time seeing anybody abandon. Even I think Trump is a clown. I mean, I absolutely, despise the guy, and I hate what he's done in the Republican Party, and I hate what he's doing to America. But the American electorate in general has to have an alternative that isn't socialism or radical leftism to turn to.
Well, I agree with that. So we're going to see who it is. I don't think that, what's her name, AOC or whatever her name is going to be the Democratic nominee for president. And so we'll have to see who it is. But there are many people running who are sane and who are not socialists. Bernie Sanders is a socialist. I think if you have, my own view is if it's Sanders or the senator from Massachusetts, somebody like that, probably won't go well. But there are plenty of others around who would be a very good alternative.
Well, I think Joe Biden in particular is one, but I think you're going to
he's too old.
Well, I think he's got the chance to, Donald Trump arguably won because of the Rust Belt phenomenon, and I think that Biden could appeal to that as well. But you're right. I think the age thing is going to be a difference. But the Democratic Party right now is not a place that is looking forward to nominating, an older white guy to be at the head of the ticket. And I think that could, then they could end up with Elizabeth Warren or somebody like that. And you've got a battle of ideologues, essentially, and I think I don't think that Donald Trump loses in that circumstance.
Right. I worry also about the two things that he's promoting, populism and nationalism. And there's a book, I told you that I'm going to get you a copy of it, The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. Now, I know there's a handful of you out there that say, wait a minute, Pachios, you're really off the rails now. We're talking about Trump, we're talking about the Republican Party, and you want to talk about the Nazi Party. What is wrong with you, Pachios? You can't be a very bright guy. Read the book. It can't happen here, I think, in America, for a lot of reasons. We have 300 years with democracy. In Germany, they had the Weimar Republic for about 20 years before Hitler came to power. Less than 20 years, 15 years before he came to power. It's a lot different than a 300-year-old tradition. Secondly, we're a very diverse nation, and Germany in the 1930s was not a diverse nation. Having said that, if you want to know about resentments and xenophobia and blaming your problems on people who may look different than you or have a different culture than you, read this book, because what you said, Lance, about exploiting people's anger, exploiting people's fears, is how Hitler came to power. And in that case, it wasn't what we know as socialists in this country. It was the growth of the Communist Party. And there were a lot of people in Germany who feared the growth of the Communist Party, which was growing in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s. And so Hitler, he ran against the communists. And it worked. And he was center-right Germans controlled the government, the Republic in Germany. Center-right parties, fairly moderate. They feared the communists, and they wanted to use Hitler's party to kind of build their coalition strength in the parliament. They wanted to use him. They didn't want him to take over. But he outsmarted them. And look at Germany in 1945 and what nationalism and populism delivered there. So these are very complicated matters, aren't they?
Well, sure. I think, we're taught from a young age the stories of, scapegoatism and the things that happened during that time period as, metaphors for what to avoid and how not to conduct ourselves, in a civic way in America now. And unfortunately, I do think it's a two-step process. I think it's this idea of tribalism and then base elections rather than some kind of compromise or convincing process that lays the groundwork for a populist person to use those same exploitation tactics that people have used throughout history. I mean, in the American South that you described before, and the Democratic stranglehold on power, when they did have that based on race, it was the same thing that any of these folks do. They prey on the fear of people.
Absolutely.
And we see it is not one-sided. We see it on both sides of the aisle. And you see it, with the advent of the internet being so critical to political dialogue now, it's so easy to do. It's so easy to do that the Russians create algorithms and take advantage of this and start these groups and change people's minds because it's just so easy and formulaic to get people into those silos and make them fear and then make them react to it. It's something that's really scary and that we should be much more self-reflective of. And I think the answer to these questions is really not that the Republican Party should do this or the Democratic Party should do this. It's every individual voter needs to stop conducting themselves in such a lazy and emotionally driven way when we deal with our public square and our political process.
See, my mother-in-law, who lives in Richmond, is a fine Southern lady. You grew up in Virginia, and I love my mother-in-law. And day and night, she has one channel. There's 100 channels on the TV.
Sure.
There's one channel on day and night, and that's Fox. And Fox News has 7 million viewers. Very powerful. And you would think that Donald Trump is a paradigm of virtue.
Sure.
I mean, you wouldn't find out that he did anything bad on Fox News, except if you watched the news in the afternoon and the early evening, because Fox News does have good reporters, the news itself.
Sure.
But the rest of it is all geared to defending him. And very few politicians have had a popular news network in their pocket, and he has them in his pocket.
Well, what's really interesting about that is, again for the two-step process, that Republicans for 2 or 3 generations have been complaining about just the opposite, that the traditional media has been generally left-leaning, and I think that's true. All the polls are...
Not like this, though.
Well, it's true, but I think that it allowed to this. When you give someone a grievance, you give license for them to overreact to it. And I think conservatives felt out of the bubble with left-leaning journalism for so long that when the technology or the media landscape changed to a point where they could do something different, they did. And people of means created Fox News, created all these different conservative echo chambers as a way to compensate for what they felt like was a deficit for many years.
So we all used to watch we'd all get our information from 3 networks in the old days on television. And Walter Cronkite, and John Chancellor and so forth. And I read a piece that you wrote. You said that you thought it would be much better when we had a lot of choices. And you changed your mind on that at all?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when the news distribution model became much more egalitarian, we had all these different ways to get media. I think myself and a lot of people celebrated that. You finally break out of this mold, especially as a conservative. But what's happened is these echo chambers have popped up, where we have very little common experience anymore, except with the people in our own political tribe. You know, we can't even see the same movies. There's so many shows on television. We're not even sharing the same, entertainment experience anymore. But in politics, the echo chamber is almost built in. You have to make an effort not to be sucked into an echo chamber. And once you're into it, and once you're, Facebook or other social media monitor what you like, and they start delivering more of what you like to you through computer formula, like you said, with your family member that watches Fox News all day long, they don't know any better because that's all the inputs that they have. The same with someone that's doing that with a left-centered thing. And I think it's been terrible. I think the lack of common experience in America through both entertainment and political and civic engagement is creating a situation where we don't have the fabric that we used to as a nation.
What about, this is a little bit different subject, the demographic changes and how it's and effects on voters. In Maine, all the Democratic vote is in the coastal counties. If you look at the map, the voting map, blue from Kittery up through Bar Harbor, all blue. It only goes inland 5 miles.
Right.
And then everything else is red. Education level, division by education level. Whereas in my day, the college-educated people were Republicans. Now, you look at the voting patterns of those who just have a high school education, they vote Republican. And those who have graduate degrees vote Democrat. That's a generalization, obviously. Why is that happening?
Well, I think it's similar to the shift that you saw in the South that you described earlier. I mean, I think I saw a very interesting interview recently where a pollster was discussing an academic book that was written by a political scientist out of Berkeley. It was called Follow the Leader. I can't remember the guy's name. But the idea was that, we look at political parties and political figures and we think, well, the average voter has this network of beliefs in are they pro-life or pro-choice or expansionist or non-expansionist or whatever they are. And then you take that matrix and then you go to find a political figure or party that meets it. But what these folks were discussing was that that's not how it works, that the science shows that people pick a leader or a party and then they adopt their ideologies to fit that. And I don't think that's ever been more clear than in the Trump era. And we saw it here as Republicans during the LePage era, where the figurehead became more important, and then everybody started trying to adapt their ideas to it. You mentioned before that the deficit has exploded under Trump, and that's a big shift. So with the demographic shift, I think we have to look less at maybe the issues and more of the characters that are at play. So in the Democratic Party, when you have Elizabeth Warren and AOC and folks that are, who I would say don't represent white working class ideology or concerns very much, you're going to naturally have that more academic, college-educated group of wealthier people that are going to be following them, where when people are talking about the nuts and bolts issues, and frankly a lot of that kind of xenophobic exploitation like Republicans have been successfully recently, then you're going to have a swath of people that maybe are struggling more. I think if you look at the demographic patterns of Trump's election, that he was very successful in this Rust Belt, through West Virginia and Pennsylvania coal area and through Maine's 2nd District, where industries have collapsed, where people don't make as much money, where they're not as educated, that there's something about that populist stance that he has that very much appeals to those folks. But I think if you had a similar populist who was talking about those similar things in a similar way in the other party, I think you'd see a shift right back. But I think the Maine map in particular, I think, is an example of the shift in the Democratic Party much more than a shift in the Republican Party, because the issues, I think, have become too esoteric for working class folks to really glom onto the way their issues used to. And labor is not the issue it used to be. I think that's a big part of it.
You think that now we had all these investigations that are going Trump. Look, I don't think impeachment gets you very far, and he won't be impeached. I mean, he can be indicted by the House,
Right.
but we got a Republican Senate. There's no way
That's right.
that they will ever throw him out of office. So that's a dead end. But we may get a lot of information about a guy being kind of crooked, and I think they will. I think I've been watching Trump long before he got interested in politics, because he wanted people to watch him. For 40 years, we've been paying attention to him. Trump Airlines, Trump University, Trump this. Guy's an egomaniac, and a lot of shortcuts. And I know people in New York that dealt with him but wouldn't deal with him anymore. So he's lived a life, socially and otherwise, that's got to have a lot of skeletons in it, and they're going to be dug up. Do you think that 35% could possibly shrink to 25%?
Well, you know, you're talking about his approval rating?
Yeah. He says no. He says that those people will stick with. If he said it himself, if I go out on Fifth Avenue and kill somebody, my supporters will not desert me.
Sure.
And I think he's right.
Well, you know, the biggest argument that I don't think is talked about for Republicans abandoning Trump is not that he's going to get impeached or whatever, but it's Democrats know very cynically that regardless of whether they find those skeletons, regardless of whether they find criminality, that they can stall progress on Republican initiatives by just bogging this guy down.
But what are his initiatives?
Well, Republican initiatives.
Yeah, but I'm going to get to, because he doesn't have any initiatives.
Right, but Republicans, he's the vessel, right? So,
yeah, he's the
so
vessel.
if Republicans want to lower taxes, if they want to put free market forces into the healthcare system, you know, if they want to make...
Wait a minute. I have to... Now, look, you're a good guy, and I admire you. So, what is the Republican health care plan? Now, we've been talking about this for 10 years. What is the Republican health care plan? I submit to you, there is not one.
Well, I think there's not a comprehensive plan, but I think that's actually part of the problem. The problem we have in healthcare in terms of how government deals with reform is that the Republican free market solution to healthcare is not to roll out Obamacare or Medicare for all or some giant comprehensive plan. It's to look at the flaws in the healthcare system, which almost all of them relate to the inhibition of the market, and to correct that. Mainway is a great example. I mean, there are things like certificate of need for hospitals. There are things, you know, finally we're getting some transparency in healthcare costs, which it's amazing to me. We can go anywhere and buy any little widget or piece of paper or coffee mug on the internet and find 1,000 different competing entities that drive the cost down and improve the quality. But in our medical system, we can't even find out how much a procedure costs without going through a massive change. That a conservative approach to fixing the healthcare system would have much more to do with instituting market forces where it's safe, where that we're sure that people can't be exploited and that there aren't inhuman things being done to cut costs. That's what the government's oversight's for. But that's what the plan is. But the plan is not coming in, you know, one day and just leveling everything. And I think
it won't happen in a day. But of course, you have to remember, I'm at an age where I've been on Medicare for a while.
Right.
It's wonderful. Works so well for me. And I've been sick. I've had open heart surgery, atrial fibrillation, back surgery. It's worked out well. And I was there for the signing of the Medicare Act in Independence, Missouri, at Harry Truman's library in 1965. And I remember what it was said, that socialism and, you know, it's just going to be awful. Now, you find out from your Republican friends how many of them are willing to say, let's get rid of Medicare.
Well, they aren't. And I'll tell you, my personal opinion about this is that we're stuck in the worst of both worlds, where we've got this ostensibly free market healthcare system, for-profit system, but it's not. There's the things, like the free market is not inherently good on its own. The things that are good about it is that when it functions in the right atmosphere, that it tends to create better things. Computers, airplanes, technology, all these things that have advanced our society have been the product of this market competition that's driven the worst base nature of humans is greed, right? And this American capitalist system has figured out a way to take that worst base nature and make it for a common good. In our healthcare system, we don't have that. We have this just total, it's more of a, like a big money hegemony than anything else, because the big companies can survive, the small companies can't, and you don't have market forces in it. I honestly would be more in favor of a government-run healthcare system altogether than what we have right now. But I do believe there's a different way, that if we injected more market forces in the right places, that it could be even better than that.
So I want to bring us to a close. Listening carefully to what you said, and it makes some sense. I'm now going to take us just to pure philosophy. There are two things I have observed in my life, read, that had great impact on me. One was a book by Theodore White, famous journalist and writer Theodore White, called In Search of History, which was all the lessons he learned observing over 40 years the great events of the world. And he talks about the Marshall Plan. And he said, I saw the revolution in China, the communist revolution. I've seen everything in the world, including the Marshall Plan. And I have determined there are just two ways that people in this world are moved in one direction or another, either at the end of a bayonet or by greasing their palm, greed. And I prefer the second, he said. The other thing I observed was a television program on public television 30, 40 years ago. And it was Pablo Casals, the famous cellist, conducting a youth orchestra in Puerto Rico. And at the middle of the rehearsal, he knocked his baton and he said, stop. He said, you must understand that good music is like good government. Freedom, but with order. And I've never forgotten those two things, Teddy White or Pablo Casals. And I think that, that goes to what we're talking about here. So I want to tell you, Lance, I really enjoyed talking to you. You're a very interesting fellow. And I think if you're willing, we come back periodically and talk about things. I think Trump's not going to be impeached, but I think we're going to find out that he's a crook. And we know he's a liar. We know he lies about everything. I think we're going to find out he's a crook, and then we're going to discuss that.
All right, that sounds great.
Thank you very much for coming.
It's been great being here. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate it.